Hello, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Brad Sherman. I have the pleasure of chairing this session today, the People, Plants and the Law lecture series. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Nabhan, who is a well-known figure in the field of people, plants and the law. He's done some very important work sacred planting, freedom expression, and biocultural recovery of sacred and ceremonial plants. Before I hand over to Gary, I'd just like to pay respect to the traditional owners and the land on which the presentation is coming, and I'd like to pay that respect to all the recipients as well. So thank you very much, Gary. Over to you.
Well, thank you, and I'm so grateful to all of you who are listening in. I've had the blessing and benefit of being involved with Australian scientists and humanities experts on some CSRIO National Science Foundation grants over the years. And so it's a delight to have collegiality with another generation of you. I should say that my background is as an ethnobotanist that by chance became involved in policy making as a member of our presidentially appointed National Park Service Commission and several other international and national bodies, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Sacred Lands Consultative Group under the Species Survival Commission, and some ad hoc groups on endangered species law and indigenous sovereignty. And so I beg your tolerance that my knowledge of the legal lexicon and precedents in other countries is very slight, but I'll do my best to give you a framework that can edify you on the current state of affairs, both in the U.S. and to some extent to Mexico. The first thing I'd like to say is one of those apologies. I'm going to talk about rights of nature, legislation, resolutions, management protocols in land management agencies, and agreements both binationally between Mexico and the U.S. and some other collaborative agreements between Native nations, indigenous nations, and faith communities. And while those give me hope that the kind of interest that many of you have in rights of nature precedents, that this whole field is growing, I need to remind us all that, at least in the United States, there's no integrated or overarching set of policy guidelines, special plant designations, acts of Congress, or nationally recognized protocols that tangibly protect sacred and ceremonial plants required for the spiritual practices of indigenous communities in a way that holds up in courts. In other words, there's 80 such resolutions, constitutional amendments to indigenous tribal constitutions, resolutions of cities, counties, or indigenous nation legislative councils, but there's very few legal tests in court that show that when one of these resolutions passes, it's upheld in court. In the case of the United States, with the current president during his first term in office, over 41 federal laws protecting cultural rights, archaeology of significance to indigenous nations, and endangered plant protection were all waived. Because of that, when I worked with a Yaqui Indian history scholar, Octaviana Trujillo, to form a 7 indigenous nation alliance to look at protecting sacred and ceremonial plants that were put in harm's way by the proposed border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. We found that we had to look at other strategies that would protect plants on the ground and resolutions that would help political leaders navigate the difficult terrain. And the one we chose was to focus on the United States Constitution protection of the freedom of religious expression, a kind of law or wording in the American Constitution over 200 years ago that both Democrats and Republicans in this country adhere to, at least with lip service, that the protection of religious freedom is fundamental to our American law and ethics. The trouble with that, of course, is that in the minds of the writers of that Constitution and the first judges that oversaw the enforcement of it, that was sought to refer to exclusively to the Western Judeo-Christian religions and not to indigenous spirituality. So we've had very few precedents using that protection of freedom of religious expression applied in the courts with successes for indigenous rights to sacred places and sacred plants or sacred animals. And I think there's similarities with this occurring in Canada and many other countries. While there may be what we perceive as precedents on the books, very often either they haven't held up in court or the federal and state agencies which are mandated to enforce these laws have a racist or classist or Christian-specific view of how freedom of religious expression is interpreted. Within our group, we literally argued over during weekly calls and several in-person retreats about making a parallel between Western religions and the notion of religious freedom that's been held in our Congress and indigenous spirituality. And the interesting point was made by some of our indigenous colleagues that they are uncomfortable with a direct parallel between institutionalized religion held with gatherings held within the walls of buildings and their practices on the land at specific sites where the spiritual rituals practiced there can only be practiced at those sites. And in theology, there's some interesting commentaries on this. Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish theologian, lamented that the Judaic tradition and by reference, indirect reference to Christian traditions, had become what he called placeless or movable and not rooted in particular places, for example, like Mount Sinai or the Garden of Gethsemane or the Wailing Wall, that as with global expansion of these religions, it became modular or replicable in any church or synagogue, and that somehow was unintentionally perhaps a means to disconnect spirituality from deep roots in place. And our Indigenous colleagues said that their point about protecting sacred places is that if they are damaged or destroyed by bulldozers and the plants on them uprooted, they simply can't be replanted someplace else, or the sacred springs or mountaintops reconstructed through geological engineering, that those are permanently lost and that there's no possibility for replicability or anthropogenic restoration of those sacred plant populations at other sites. Navajo or Dene medicine men that I've worked with have also said that their sacred plants must be collected at particular places in the pilgrimage route, kind of a songline sort of trajectory in their origin story, and that the same sacred or medicinal plant has no value if not collected at specific sites. So after arguing for several months about the degree to which there were parallels and how there were not parallels, one of the leaders said, "That is true, and we all know it, but how are we going to leverage support for protecting our sacred plants and sacred sites if we don't invoke the Constitution, because every cultural, archaeological, and endangered plant law has been suspended by the President of the United States?" So we chose to take actions, including a widespread media campaign in national publications, interfaith publications, and Indigenous newspapers and magazines, affirming that Indigenous nations' access to protection and use of plants cannot be revoked because it's guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. And we stuck through that for the last 7 years. At another level, we had to realize that even a case like that getting into the courts and through the Supreme Court process in the United States would take years, and we had to take action on a more rapid pace to protect the 70 or 80 species of sacred plants along the border, and tens of thousands of sacred sites between California and Texas on the 3,000-mile border where the wall was being built. Tens of thousands of sacred sites, some of them with sacred plants growing in them, that were in harm's way of bulldozers. And so there were 5 different actions that I'd like to just briefly outline. And one is something that we've continued with, and that's not adversarial or litigious actions, but collaborative uh, uh, common ground building um, with various other interest groups. One of them being National Park Service superintendents and research staffs that were charged with including Indigenous nations as consultants in the management of those parks and UNESCO biosphere reserves. And because many of the National Park Service superintendents have worked in parks uh, uh, that we might call culture parks as much as nature parks. They were already sensitized to these issues, had regular consultations with tribal leaders, and were completely for protecting sacred plants and the sacred sites associated with them in national parks and trying to negotiate on uh, Indigenous nations' behalf for the routing of structures, roads, and the pumping of groundwater to be diverted away from impact on the sacred sites and plant populations. The second one was initiated by young activists who were initially paid as interns on our project and then with our blessing, broke away from us to decide to do their own actions of resistance or defiance to be arrested so that this would come to court. And two young women of the Tohono Nation, Nellie, Jo, and Amber, went to pray at a place on the border where vegetation was to be bulldozed at a sacred freshwater spring. Did their prayers in the morning, and as construction workers came in with bulldozers and other heavy equipment to knock down some of the sacred plants, they sat in the seat of the bulldozers and were arrested. They were jailed, put in a detention center, and unfortunately, the law enforcers who arrested them thought they were men, and so they were humiliated by being put in a men's section of a federal prison until their lawyers got them released. One pleaded no context, and her parents and colleagues paid for her expenses, and the other one fought being jailed at all at a sacred site where the sacred plants grew that it had been used in ceremonies there for centuries. That effort resulted in a appellate court finding that because National Park Service superintendents who managed that location had granted Indigenous nations access for private ceremonies where the site was closed to the public for hours or days since the 1930s, that there was a legal precedent for practicing their religious freedom at these sites, and an unreasonable burden had been placed on the two young women, and so the charges against Amber were dismissed, providing us with a legal precedent in other cases. The third action we took was to do a tribal resolution for the Indigenous nation with a 1 million hectare reservation along the border, the second largest um, indigenous nation reserve in the United States, or the lower 48. And they were grieved to have seen tens of thousands of their sacred plants felled by bulldozers before their own tribal lawyers could take action. And what we did was we helped them craft a resolution that first went around to each of the 12 districts. The districts are usually about 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers in size, and it had to individually pass the vote of each district council before it went to the legislative council of the indigenous nation, the Tohono Nation. And again, it passed again and was ratified by their tribal governor. And this said that it was a resolution, not a law, that they considered it a violation of their religious freedom for anyone to damage, bulldoze, mutilate, or transplant the sacred saguaro cactus within their the confines of their reserve and outside their reserve in their Aboriginal homelands. And the reasons that they gave were twofold that did have good legal precedence. One, that the fruit of those tall, towering columnar cacti, the saguaro or giant cactus, the fruit were used in the rainmaking ceremonies for centuries. And when the United States took hegemony over their territory, U.S. Indian agents jailed the spiritual leaders who led the ceremonies in which the cactus fruit was made into a mild wine so that they could sing down the clouds and start the rainy season by attracting rains to the desert. The interesting point was that those indigenous leaders were jailed and sometimes were starved or mutilated in jail and killed. And when a more humane Secretary of Indigenous Affairs came in the 1930s, John Collier, he reversed that decision of his agencies and said that Indigenous people anywhere in the U.S. have the right to practice their religion without obstruction from any federal or state legal authority. On top of that, there is a body of stories recorded in print over 2.5 centuries from these people that in their origin narrative, the saguaro cacti origin was that it was once one of 2 children who were abandoned by their family, sank into the ground and reemerged as cacti to warn any human from injuring children or injuring sacred plants. And that had been documented by the writings of tribal ethnographers and indigenous writers themselves for well over 1.5 centuries, and established the status of these cacti as sacred persons that deserved status for legal personhood. And again, that was ratified and then widely publicized throughout the United States and the world once they passed that resolution. That led to another action with the federal agencies that had done the damage to tens of thousands of those sacred plants, who had a ruling during President Biden's administration that those plants um, should be protected and that any federal um, construction action, even for national defense, must attempt to avoid any damage or destruction of the sacred plant populations if there is any conceivable way to detour around the plant populations or to avoid direct damage to them. That came a little too late since 10,000 plants were already mutilated and killed. But pictures in newspapers of seeing elderly women on their hands and knees crying next to the carcasses of these plants with the caption, "Don't they know that these are people too?" triggered an enormous range of support, not only from other indigenous nations, but from the interfaith community in the United States. And that's the last point that I want to make about building coalitions. We not only did it between indigenous nations, including nations that do not live on the border, but all across the United States, with federal agency land managers who were sophisticated and sensitive people. But we also did it through interfaith coalitions and alliances of religions, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, that stood in solidarity with Native spiritual practitioners. And to me, that is one of the most interesting leveraging points with our very conservative federal administration right now, because many of the president's cabinet and other appointees claim to be Christians who see religious freedom as paramount to what their administration is about. The first time when Trump was in, he actually set up a commission promoting religious freedom of expression in other countries that the U.S. gave funding to. Obviously, the U.S. is not funding many or any countries right now or damaging them. But the point is that we had a leeway then through the faith communities to contact far right as well as far left Congress people and make the grounds that freedom of religious expression was something that could be done where no one really loses by us playing that hand in land management. There's been a few cases with regard to sacred mountains in the U.S. where that hasn't proven true, where mountain climbers that wanted to free climb Devil's Tower and were asked by indigenous nations not to desecrate Devil's Tower by leaving their carabiners and ropes and other climbing materials, that climbers challenged that by saying they had religious freedom to climb that mountain because going up to the peak, to the top of sacred peaks, was in the Bible. And in most cases, the agencies have found a way to protect native sovereignty, or at least co-management of those sacred places, by granting the climbers some minimal concessions. So it's that argument that we had about religious freedom is not fraught with weaknesses, but to date, we've had more agency side with indigenous nations and interfaith alliances than to refute them or dismiss them. What I can say more in general is that, like the interest of all of you in the uh, legal issues regarding the rights of nature, in the last 3 decades since I was on the IUCN panel on sacred lands with theologians and conservation strategists, um, the teaching of these case studies in universities and colleges and other kinds of fora for uh, periodic supplemental education for lawyers has increased exponentially. Harvard is teaching a course on rights of nature, University of California, branch campuses are teaching it. Most community colleges of Native nations, and there's about 120, I believe, in the United States, are teaching rights of nature. And the wording, like I said, in constitutions or amendments to the constitutions of different indigenous nations in the United States is proliferating. And ironically, many of us humbly defer to initiatives taken in Australia and New Zealand for really prompting tangible legal efforts in this regard. We were already aware of the 1970 book, Do Trees Have Standing? But uh, it would be easy to say that that book stimulated a lot of debate at first, but less action. More recently, Native American studies scholar Steve Pavlik in uh, 2015 asked in an article, should trees have legal standing in Indian or indigenous country, which he then set a basis for precedents across the United States. And Christopher Stone, who wrote that original classic, Should Trees Have Standing, has continued to update with editions of his book and seminars um, all the different legal precedents that uh, have been used not only in the United States but other countries. So there's a groundswell of literacy about these issues, not only from legal scholars, but uh, indigenous community leaders. And I think we're on pretty safe grounds that uh, once we have some sensitivity again in our federal administration, that the further protection of these um, rights to spiritual expression will be rapidly advanced. This last administration with Biden and Harris, we had excellent Native American scholars in a special office beneath Chuck Sams, a Native American leader who was the first Indigenous National Park Service uh, director that we've had. And they made great progress in training federal employees about these processes and setting up protocols and management guidelines for indigenous gathering of sacred and medicinal plants in national parks and wildlife refuges. So even though there's been a retreat or setback since the present administration came in, the groundwork and training of federal employees and to some extent state employees advanced tremendously as a result of the damage and tragedies that happened during the first Trump administration. Um, with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. I should say that I'm also involved in the same kind of issues in the Middle East. I'm going to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the new Laudato Si Caring for Creation Center that Pope Leo set up to talk about Catholic um, uh, uh, church support for the protection of sacred plants. And a friend of mine, Yoda Batsaki, plant humanities scholars at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., has had discussions with the Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church or all Orthodox churches about these same issues. So the other route we're doing, while we have no possible forward motion for the next couple of years with the current federal administration, is to go to international bodies that are looking for interfaith support for environmental initiatives like this.
Thank you, Gary. That was a really fascinating talk, and it's a sort of optimistic way to sort of finish up. We have plenty of time for questions. If anybody has a question, if they just want to either raise their hand or Sanjay, you're muted, I think. You're
Hey,
still muted. Yeah.
okay. Hey, thanks for the presentation. I appreciate it. I am involved with the Earth Law Center as an ambassador focused on rights of nature. So I'm curious if we talk about sacred plants, with that same premise, can we, and legal precedent, can we potentially also go to sacred animals? So, for example, the buffalo in U.S. is sacred. And similarly, a lot of indigenous communities globally have considered animals as sacred and part of sort of the cosmic connection they have. So I'm just curious if that is a possibility. And the second is, I guess by using religion, we are still using it as a human anthropogenic construct. So I'm curious your perspectives on that as well. I
Yeah,
realize the rules and laws are made by humans, so I get it, but I'm just
yeah,
curious.
yeah. I love what you're saying. Thank you. First of all, in ways, the animal slash wildlife arguments have more cachet in environmental groups in supporting indigenous groups or supporting cross-cultural collaborations. And you probably know about ones for whales, not only bison and rivers. And so we're seeing that the next step in all of this is management plans that have taken place for bison. I was at the first meeting of the um, a North American Bison Summit where uh, I moderated the session of indigenous bison restoration projects as a guest moderator. And they're very, very advanced with this. And I could mention a whole litany of other animals, but most recently in our area, um, the same people that I worked with on the sacred plant resolution have gotten a resolution to protect um, the transboundary migration of jaguars. We have 5 large felines in that cross the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and so the indigenous nation of the Tohono just passed a resolution on that with the help of Center for Biodiversity and other groups advising them on the technical content. Um, so I my guess is that we'll see, because of the charismatic megafauna attraction that most Americans have, that in this country, at least, the wildlife efforts will move faster than the plant efforts, just because there's a larger constituency of support. I love, I love the the second part of your question. I'm a professed member of an ecumenical Franciscan order that I've argued should rename itself to be um, uh, interfaith and interspecies Franciscans, and have written documents for them um, trying to make the argument that in biblical writings and what they care deeply about the words of Jesus of Nazareth and St. Francis of Assisi, there's a clear nod uh, to all plants and animals having uh, souls or being holy beings, and that given that we're part of that Franciscan tradition, um, we shouldn't limit our order to even Christians or to people of faith, but um, embrace all species as St. Francis did. And so I worked at the first Earth Day headquarters in 1970 as a young sprout. I'm giving a talk at the Laudato Si Center, dialogue, I shouldn't say a talk, with their staff and a cardinal from the Vatican on the 55th anniversary. But I'm also visiting Assisi and the Pontifical Academy to see whether we can move discussions in the way that you're suggesting, that we'll still always have that construct of the anthropocentric bias embedded in our case law. But in terms of our actions and in terms of the vocabulary we use, I think we're already moving away from crass anthropocentrism.
Thanks. Any other questions? You want to raise a hand? I've got anybody there? No. Gareth, I was at a talk a year or so ago, and people in France and Italy, I believe, were going back to laws in the 16th and 17th centuries, which I think ultimately were built upon Roman law, where statues and so not just living things, but inanimate objects were not given rights, but they're given responsibilities. So if a statue would fall and hurt somebody, they would then try the statue and then execute it. And so it's an extension of this argument, and they were trying to extend these notions out based upon very fundamental Roman law principles, and I can share those things with you. And one thing I was going to ask you was, one of the things in Australia that's proved to be particularly problematic is proving connection to place. A lot of the stories that don't have the sort of the rich ethnographic history you spoke about do the courts here accept those ethnographic stories as proof of connection to place and the sacredness of plants? Or is that yet another challenge that has to be faced going forward?
Oh, I agree with you entirely that it's another challenge. And, um, that I think that we have to remember that there's people on the ground that the courts don't know about, that are federal or state or Indigenous nation managers who have already maneuvered agreements on the ground. For instance, when I went to the IUCN Species Survival Commission meetings in Perth in the 90s, we did a tour with some Aboriginal leaders from the Perth area, and they took us on the wildest field trip I've ever been on. We were literally following song lines across golf courses and through subdivisions in Perth, where this remarkable man had brokered access agreements so that the song line could be maintained. And he showed them we have a name for them. We have a similar kind of marking of trees in the Southwest U.S. where you take off a layer of bark and do a symbol on the trunk of the tree. And so he would take, again, like many places around Tucson where it's just extra urban, ex-urban subdivisions of retired people, he would take them out and say, "Hey, do you know that in your golf course rough, you have some of those trees, and this is a song line." And really, because through his charisma, he brought on, we call them deed and covenant agreements of retirement communities and subdivision properties, gated communities. I sort of hate that world of enclosure of public lands with their own laws, but he got them to write into their deed and covenant equivalents the right for Aboriginal use of and access to those song lines. And we have similar things going on in Arizona as well. So I think sometimes we go to the highest level hoping that a decision by the Supreme Court will result in trickle-down effects. And sometimes those grassroots efforts by very good cross-cultural communicators gives us a model on the ground. The best I know of is Madeline Island, where the Ojibwe or bedrock or not bad rock. I've harvested wild rice with them. I'll get first. Bad River Chippewa have worked with the landowner community there and gained access and removed sheds and other buildings from their trails along the largest island in Lake Superior, the largest lake in the U.S. and Canada, freshwater lake, and redone the street signs on the whole island to refer to these trails that oral history told them the names of, just like the songlines tradition of the Walpuri and Pinchinjara and other groups in Australia. So it's a really interesting precedent to look with. It's part of the land back movement of taking common lands of property associated with property owners and deeding them over to the original inhabitants. And it's in multiple states, and in Maine, the Indigenous nations up there have worked with Trust for Public Lands and other groups, and about a sixth of the state is now under collaborative agreements like that in fairly remote parts of Maine, of course, where there's not a lot of urban encroachment. But nevertheless, they found common ground and made permanent co-management agreements.
Thank you. John, you've got a question?
Thanks. Thanks, Brad.
Right.
Just some things you raised in my mind is, I suppose from the Australian perspective, is your thoughts around just what you were speaking there about. Now, I love that context around the Franciscan space. Timber Creek, the High Court ruling on that around, what happened in that case was the loss or diminution of traditional attachment to country, but also right. The loss of spiritual connection. And if I think about what you said, and I hope I got it right about the model on the ground, it sort of relates now to, the work I do as a biocultural strategist, with local government and things like that, is from the spatial context. And one of the key things for me around the spiritual, or the attachment to country, for example, and the spiritual connection, is things like rainbow serpent hydrology, which are those laws that are put in place. It's the customary laws, and people make this, to me, they make this wrongful decision. It's a bit tied into some of that old, that thinking that is around culture, whereas the starting point actually is around customary law and what the infrastructure that's embedded in the landscape. So the example of that would be, for me, would be Yilambal, and that's our rainbow serpent hydrology landscape. And I've actually worked with my uncle, and we've mapped out our own single clan family landscape we've had for 65,000 more years. I'm using 65 because one of our groups have had the dating done, so that's where we'll sit with evidence base. So I agree that there's problematic things out there, like even with national parks. So having worked as a program manager for the Director General of the EPA in Queensland, one of the early conversations I had was about the acquisition of tenement, tenure for those representative areas. At early starting point, I kicked up an issue around management intent, management principles, which were just naturally based, and there was no cultural base to it. So it puts our people at that backstab. The Roman stuff that Brad spoke about is really interesting to me, and that on one level is around genetically modified species. Once they move off, if I understand that Roman law, and I was thinking about it, once those genetically modified organisms move off country or off the farming space, which is where the agreements are with those sorts of things, and it rewilds itself, is it no longer under the governance of that particular company? So there's a whole range of things, but basically I agree with some of the things that you're talking about, because we've got 138,000 hectare pastoral lease. I'm just about ready to move into developing a management plan, fire regime plan for it. And one of the things I've looked at, because of rainbow serpent hydrology law, is to look at hydrostatic pressures in the landscape and how that affects things like soil and so on, which on another tangent, and it's really good you're talking about this, because the whole dynamic around this, because one of the things that I've picked up with some of our practices is that there is potential there that we may even change the microbial trait of the soil. And in my head, what I'm thinking about is that the papers that have been done now by some of our Indigenous scientists is the species that have been moved from one particular country and gone with a woman, for example, further south. Those things are connected. I think they're connected, and they're connected in a way that it's like that we have our particular clan family landscape scale. We do these particular things, and it's a bit like nutrient cycling. It's the biological matter. So yeah, sorry, mate. Sorry to be long in that, but yeah, it's sort of kicked your conversations kicked up a whole range of things in my mind.
Oh, thank you. I want to mention two things. When I did some time out in the Red Center, I was reading a lot of Peter Latz's ethnographic work on place names and indigenous mapping. And I was always struck in some of that ethnographic literature where the ethnographers would say, "What do you do now? There's not a peak in sight. We're out in the flatlands. Where does it go now?" And the response of some of the Aboriginal guides who really knew the landscape was, "It goes underground now." And it sounds laughable to a Western mind about that, but I realize we have the same thing here, that the Tohono O'odham that I've worked with off and on for 45 years believe that all the freshwater springs are related to the ocean, and that there's underground channels that have to be protected in order for the most precious geomorphic habitat in desert regions to survive into the future, and that's freshwater springs. If we were, something like my friend Larry Stevens has just done a thing on worldwide status of freshwater springs, and they're the most endangered habitat type in terrestrial environments, but they're also the one with highest density of sacred sites. And so that it feels natural to me that desert people would say there's a subterranean / spiritual connectivity between these springs that is significant. And so I think we could even say that the rights of nature in the future will even extend to aquifers, which Indigenous people intuitively know are related to the health of their freshwater springs in arid landscapes. So that's with me. I also think that we have precedents in the United States, one from my deceased father-in-law, Bates Wilson, who talked the National Park Service in protecting cryptogamic or cryptobiotic crusts in Arches National Park in the 1970s. And he argued that they were micro landforms that were vulnerable to trampling by hikers, mountain bikes, or whatever, and that they would not grow back to their same form over a person's lifetime. So he rerouted all hiking trails in the national park away from the areas where the cryptogamic crusts were most vulnerable. So the rights of microbes is the other frontier, and soil microbes to me are pivotal to the future of conservation. And obviously people aren't naming microbes like microbiologists do, but they have an intuitive understanding when they get to these microcosmic landforms that they're special. And so they don't need to taxonomically name them as lichen and fungi and mosses and algae. We can hardly name them because they're of multiple kingdoms, But the point is, there is respect for those in indigenous cultures that predate Western legal definitions of personhood. So to me, you're onto some very important things here. I can't respond to all of them, but I think your intuitions and everything you said are spot on.
Yeah, that last point you made there about, where some of these things sit, it's like, I really follow Rowan Fisher, Dr. Rowan Fisher. He's doing the fire stuff in Northern Australia. And some of his images are fantastic, where the same water system, but seeing it in flood and seeing it under fire, and they're just like twins. And that's the point. Like, as the last year spending as Deputy Chair of Australia's National Committee on Aboriginal Water Interests and Australia's water reform, one of the key things I was always interested in was the fire. 2023, 84 million hectares under wildfire. But it's the point about what we do with those fires in terms of that nutrient cycling. When country's fired at the right time, but the nutrient recycling thing's even more interesting when you're thinking about what you're talking there with aquifers, because it's not only moving surface water down, it's what actually goes in through that nutrient cycle. And that at one level on the Earth's surface, it's about photosynthesis. But in those aquifers, it's about chemosynthesis, and it's the bacteria that gets down into the systems. Now, we've long before people really identified Steigerfauna. We knew about those things, you know,
How wonderful.
the blind animals under the, you know, in the Great Artesian Basin, the paleo streams, you know, where they were and so on. So yeah, you're right. It's a, and I think this comes back to the point that I raised with the chief scientist for Queensland at that point when I was, and I'm still in the biodiscovery group, but about the need for convergent science, you know. So that's I think one of those game changers, which then will have an effect on things like the way that Timber Creek unfolded. I think that's going to really start to move people and really make us think about what that is in terms of the spiritual attachment and how. And lastly, I'll just leave you with case law, common law now, like the one that interests me is Universe Eaton, and what Professor Gray says about what people don't understand about property rights. Yes, in Timber Creek, property rights is land, but property rights is also biodiversity. And people think that it's an object or thing, which he points to, but it's actually the legal notion. And it's every conceivable relationship you have with that thing or object. And that's where I think it lies for us to reconstruct our cultural landscapes, our laws, customary practices, and so on. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, just a quick joinder on that. You're bringing up another thing that a lot of the Native American writers that I interact with really talk about how their languages are transitive verb oriented, not noun oriented. So they're much more interested in the rights of fire, of flooding, of dynamics than static thingness of nature. We're good at enclosing using European concepts of enclosure around nature to create a national park. They're saying we're more interested in the cross-boundary dynamism that isn't looking at nature as things, but of actions, of spirited movements. And so I think we have a lot to learn to know how to even accommodate those things legally. But thank you for your brilliant insights. I hope to learn more from you.
Thanks. So we've got one last question, Carly.
Hello, thank you. I read Ethnobiology for the Future several years ago, and must say it's an honor to be here. So thank you for hosting our time tonight. My question is, as an environmental writer who's really passionate about biocultural diversity and the rights of nature and the recognition of all things as sacred and numinous, but also as someone of European American origin with no specific cultural practices in this way. I know many young folks like me of a similar demographic, and so I'm wondering what you view as the most effective and culturally appropriate way for folks like me to become involved in supporting this very important work.
Many of the Indigenous elders that I've known for 40 or 50 years that I've worked hand in hands with say the most interesting thing to me, because I had the same fear and trepidation you're mentioning when I first met them. And they said, what we really want of settlers or immigrants to our land is for them to learn how to be good allies, that we work really hard within our culture about that it's not about individual achievement or ego, it's about collaborative action. And they say most of the key environmental decisions that affect their lives, they have to build a cross-cultural constituency, because Indigenous communities are such a small percentage of the overall population of the United States that unless they build those alliances, they will lose nearly every political battle. And so I've been on the board of the Black Mesa Trust of Hopi and Dene or Navajo leaders who brought in geohydrologists, ethnobotanists like me, legal strategists on their team, and we were equal partners with them at their invitation. The first day I went to do a Native American Natural Resource Outreach Center at Northern Arizona University, Hopi spiritual leaders came in and blessed my office and left a prayer feather above my desk. And I said, "Do you do that for every new faculty member?" They said, "No, but we need your office as a training center for good allies because the fights we're up against, we need all hands on deck. And if we can use your office to train people, we'll all be better off." So I think many Aboriginal, Indigenous, uh, Native communities know that they're in a cross-cultural world. They're not isolationists. They seek out people with common values. And if you have technical skills that can complement the ones that they have in their own community that they see support their vision, they welcome you rather than repel you. And I've had to learn the hard way what the limits of that, what the guardrails are to being a good ally. But I think it's something we should all aspire to because none of us lives in a monocultural world. We're all in contact with other cultures all the time. And so I'm Lebanese American, and I've been in on Israeli, Palestinian, Armenian, Lebanese peace and reconciliation work in the Middle East. Some of the toughest work I did, but it's with my own family. So I think the general patterns and values and practices are the same, whether it's that kind of peacemaking or whether it's a kind of peace and reconciliation that reverses what happened with the land grabs of previous centuries and the destruction of vital resources to communities. And so one of my friends said, get over white man's guilt and help us. And I don't say everyone agrees on that, but I've been fortunate enough to work with people who really affirm that. So thank you for the great question.
Thank you for the great answer.
Yeah, thank you. And with that, I'd just like to thank Gary for sharing his experience and this very important topic. And on behalf of everyone else, I'd like to thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you at the next lecture in a few months' time. Thank you.